Hello and welcome back to the week 7 episode, or sorry, episode 7, week 11 of the College Football Fanatics podcast. Um this week had a lot of interesting things. Sorry, I forgot to close the door. This week had a lot of interesting things going on in terms of major shakeups at the top. We're going to talk about the second week of the college football playoff rankings. We're going to talk about the Heisman race. We're going to talk a lot about Georgia this week and the Tennessee game with Georgia, and that not devastating loss for Tennessee's college football playoff hopes, but a tough loss that I think they're trying to deal with the fallout of. So let's start off with the Heisman race. So I haven't looked at the race since the week since Saturday essentially. But last week, the top 3 contenders for the Heisman race, CJ Stroud was at number 1 with 78 points. Hendon Hooker was at number 2 with 76 points, and Blake Corum was at number 3 with 25 points. So after this past week, I think that Blake Corum should be a clear front runner. Blake Corum is probably one of the best players in college football, and I think that's evident by anybody who who looks at him and who looks at his stats, but also just watches him play with Michigan. I mean, Blake Corum, in my opinion, carries that offense. He currently has 1,200 yards on the ground. This season, he has almost 200 attempts. He's at 199 right now. He has 16 touchdowns and he has an average of 6 yards per carry. Now, to anybody, that's an elite running back. And if you compare him to previous Heisman winners, the stats all look very similar. And so I think that all adds to his to his chances of becoming I think he'll actually, if he wins, he'll become the first Michigan running back to pick up a Heisman. And I really think that would I think that would help in recruiting. I think that would help team morale. I mean, he's a sophomore, I believe. Sorry, he's a junior. He's a junior. So he still has another year left if he wants to stay at Michigan. He has at least 1 year. He might have been redshirted. I can't remember his first year. But he definitely has at least 1 more year of eligibility, or 2 years because of the COVID COVID year. So he has 2 years of retained eligibility. And I highly doubt that he's going to stay for 2 more years. I think he'll either end up going to the NFL draft this year, depending on where his draft stock is, or he'll end up staying on another year and then going to the draft after next year. So having almost 1,200 yards on the season so far and still only being in week 11 with 3 more games left to go, and in the fact that he has well over 100 yards in almost every single game this season is a good indicator that he'll probably have about 1,500 yards at the end of the season, maybe a little less. But I really think that you can count on him to have those. So previous to the game against Georgia, um, Hendon Hooker had a 52-4 um, touchdown to interception ratio. Um, and that is one of the most accurate touchdown interception ratios I think I've seen in a really long time. Um, because the fact is, if you can have anything like a 4-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio, you're pretty solid at that point. And this is over his entire career. This year he has 21 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, which is a nearly 12-to-1. It's like 11.5-to-1. Or sorry, 10.5 to 1. So it's a 10.5-to-1 touchdown ratio. He has 2,500 yards, which is tied for the 16th most passing yards. And he has a QB rating of 89.1. And his career stats end up looking pretty similar. I mean, if you look at last year for him, he had almost 3,000 yards and 29. He had 2,945 yards, so almost 3,000 passing yards. He had 31 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. So I actually I got that touchdown to interception ratio wrong. I'll have a correction for that probably sometime next week. I might put it in my Friday video on the College Football Fanatics podcast channel that I've been starting. All of these that's actually a good time to loop it in and remind you guys that I'm starting a channel for this podcast specifically. We'll have multiple episodes a week. We'll have previews of games. We'll have post game thoughts and we'll have Monday weekend reviews and things like that. We'll also have these episodes on the channel. They'll be posted as videos, so it'll all be completely integrated. You guys will be able to watch the episodes here. You'll be able to watch it there if you missed the live streams here. So don't forget. And let's get back to it. CJ Stroud is number one, or was number one after Hendon Hooker, after the struggling win against Northwestern, a team that has not looked good all season, a team that does not even have a win in America this season, is an embarrassing stain on his season so far. I mean, yes, they won 21-7 against a team that they should have blown out like 55-0. I mean, there is no way that Northwestern should have ever been anywhere close to making this a game for for Ohio State, considering just how many weapons Ohio State has. I watched part of the game and it was just Ohio State couldn't get any passing game. And then I understand that weather is a factor, but you can't blame bad football solely on weather. I mean, there are some plays where, yes, you can blame bad weather for things. If it's raining, you can blame some drops because of the rain and things like that. And it was definitely very windy in Evanston, this past weekend on Saturday. But CJ Stroud should have been able to overcome that and still put up a good performance. Um, his performance was anything but, anything but. I mean, it was almost like I said, like I just said, it was embarrassing. If you're an Ohio State fan, I mean, he didn't even get 100 yards in the air on 10 completions, which is such an anomaly for a player of his caliber. Um, and it's really hard to justify keeping Ohio State at number 2, in my opinion, in the college football playoff rankings when, yes, Michigan struggled against Rutgers in the first half, but then pulled out like 40 points in the second half. And I think 28 points in the last quarter alone. Um, I mean, it was really, really ugly. And I can't overstate that enough. And the fact that they are still number 2 bothers me. Um, against a Northwestern team that's only win is against Nebraska when Scott Frost was still the head coach, and their only win was on a neutral site field in Ireland. That is their only win. Uh, there is not a single player uh, on Northwestern's football team right now that I can think of off the top of my head that I would say is a very clear cut um, first round pick. Um, Now, I haven't watched a ton of Northwestern's games this season, but I still stand by that statement of there's not a clear first round pick that I can think of off the top of my head. If I went back into the film a little bit more, I might be able to pick out somebody who could be a number one or a first round pick, but to almost to be tied with a team like that for for to be losing at the end of the first quarter and then tied at the half, it shouldn't be shouldn't have been happening. So CJ Stroud's best win, in my opinion, is against Penn State, where he threw for 354 yards and a touchdown. Um, and that game, I think, also exposed some struggles um, the in the game where Penn State was still able to keep up with Ohio State up until about 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Um, Up until that point, I mean, they were there for point with Ohio State, and that doesn't fall on Stroud. I think that actually tends to fall on um, Ohio State's defense a little more, even though I do consider Ohio State's defense within the top 5 defenses in the country. Um, the fact of the matter is that I don't think that they truly showed up until the fourth quarter. Um, and now Penn State is currently ranked number 14, so they're still in the top 10. Um, but like I said, this Penn State team is a team that lost by um 20 something points, I think, to Michigan. Um, so I think that that's something to think about. All right. So the next one is something that I found really ridiculous. So LSU and Alabama played, and LSU won for the first time since 2019, when they had Joe Burrow at quarterback over in Louisiana. Um, and after the win this weekend, the overtime win where actually I didn't get to see the game live because I was at the Michigan Rutgers game, but I watched the ending of it on my phone, and I really and uh Brian Kelly's choice to go for two um on the last play of the game in overtime after they scored their touchdown um was really risky. Um if they didn't make it, they would have lost the game, but they did make it, so they won. But my dad and I, at the time when we were watching it together, were actually um, talking about how risky of a play that really was, and we were questioning Brian Kelly's choice in that matter because, of course, it's easy to armchair coach, and I get that I'm not in that position, but and I also understand that drawing it out for 3, 4 overtimes, in which this is a game that absolutely could have made it to 3 or 4 overtimes, um, is really one of those things where I'm like, ooh, if it's I'm glad it worked out, but if it hadn't, man, it would have been a really, really, really hard sell for me to say that was the right choice. Um, so I also want to talk about UGA with Georgia in terms of their game against Tennessee. Um, UGA has a really young uh, offensive line, in my opinion. Most of them are sophomores. Um, there's only one junior, and he's the right tackle, I believe, for their offensive line. But Georgia has really, really good experience on the perimeter in players like Darnell Washington and Brock Bowers. Um, and it really shows it really showed in the game in this past week's game against Tennessee. Um, Tennessee got bullied by Georgia's O line. They were being pushed around. Tennessee's O line got bullied by Georgia's D line, but Georgia's O line also bullied Tennessee's D line pretty handedly too. There was not a lot of times where I was watching Stetson Bennett struggle to stay alive. Um, and this really matters because O-line is the lifeblood of any football team. If you don't have a strong O-line, you don't you don't have a good football team at that point. Uh, if your O-line is letting players in and your quarterback is just scrambling to stay alive so that he doesn't get sacked and lose 30 yards, 40 yards in a game, um, you don't have, your quarterback just won't have time to throw the ball at all. Um, but Georgia's O line held up very, very well against a Tennessee team that, granted, had questions um, going into this game. Um, by all means, Tennessee's defense is not the best. Georgia's defense, by comparison, is leagues better. I'd consider Tennessee's defense to be somewhere around a number 10 to number 12 in the country in terms of best defenses. And you really saw this on the perimeter when some of Georgia's wide receivers and that includes Georgia's tight end Brock Bowers really blew um, past Tennessee's defensive backs. There were several plays where Stetson Bennett threw a long pass, and you look at it and you're like, how is that wide receiver? How is Brock Bowers wide open for that catcher? How is Arian Smith? How is he wide open for the first long pass of the game? And it's because he's blowing past Tennessee's defense. And another of the reasons Georgia is showed that they were the better team this past weekend at home was their conversion rate is really good in the red zone. Um, Prior to the game, they had 46 out of 47 trips to the red zone end in points. 33 of those were touchdowns, and 13 of those were field goals. Um, and it created a ability for Georgia to always end up getting points, no matter how much they struggled in the red zone itself. They'd end up getting some form of points. Um, Tennessee looked like they couldn't figure themselves out. Um, there were times where I thought, Hendon Hooker's looking really good on this drive, but then there were these times where I'm like, what is the Tennessee offense doing? And it really was hard to see a team that I had a lot of hopes about. I think last week I predicted that Tennessee would win this game, and I thought that it would actually turn into a shootout. I thought the score was going to be closer to like closer to the 30s, than closer to the tens. Um, but it wasn't, and the game ended 27-13, and Georgia won. And now I don't want to say Georgia torpedoed Tennessee's playoff hopes, um, because Michigan and Ohio State still have to play. So there's going to be at least one more undefeated team that loses. Um, but they dealt a significant blow to the idea of um, Tennessee making the college football playoffs, I think, for their first time. And one of the reasons that Georgia won, along with having a phenomenal O line and D line, was that in the open field, when say Hendon Hooker, or when he would throw a pass, or when when their running back would, one of the rare times, break out of the backfield and just truly be in the open field, UGA didn't miss tackles at all, almost. And it was clear to see that this is a team that, you might get past their first seven, but when you're in the open field, they're not going to, you know, try these shoestring tackles or these weak arm tackles that don't go anywhere. Um, this is a team that you're not just going to run over them, essentially. And so that was another portion of their win. One of the strongest portions, though, of their win is Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is, in my opinion, the best tight end in college football right now. He has 34 receptions for 574 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he had a touchdown. He had a touchdown against Tennessee this past weekend. He's 7th in receiving in the SEC. He averages nearly 17 yards a reception, which for any player is pretty significant, but I think for a tight end is even more so. I mean, this is a giant of a human being. He's really large. In overall tight ends, he's number 2 in receiving. The only player that's ahead of him is Dalton Kincaid with 614 yards. And Brock Bowers is also the lead receiver on that UGA football team. Um, he's one of 8 players that have at least 100 yards on the season so far. And I think that plays a factor in the sense that you have a large guy. I think he's somewhere around 6'5". You have a large guy with a large radius of where he can grab the ball out of the air from. And he's one of those players that if he goes up for the ball, it's almost guaranteed that he's either going to come down with it or nobody's going to come down with it. He's not one of those players that, they're going to get into a fight for the ball and it'll be picked off at the last second. So Brock Bowers, that radius is really, really important for Georgia. If he were to get hurt, I think that offense would lose a serious weapon that they've been looking at. I want to talk about a little bit about before I get on to TCU, I do want to say that I have noticed with certain programs, and I think that this happens more in the SEC, more in the Big 12 than it does in conferences such as the Big 10 and even I think the Pac 12. Players staying longer than 4 years at a university. And this was a big complaint that I had when Georgia played against Michigan last year. If you look at the ages on the teams, I think the average age of the Michigan O line was somewhere around 22 years old. I believe if you looked at the average age of the Georgia O line, it was somewhere around 26 years old, if I can remember correctly from last semester. And I understand that, when you're a 26-year-old playing against 22-year-olds, you should beat them. Because at that point, I don't consider any 22-year-old, and I'm 21 right now, but I don't consider any 22-year-old to truly really be an adult in the sense of the physical capacity that they are able to display. Uh, it's essentially putting up a college kid against an NFL caliber player, essentially. And that's, I think, is truly an important point to stress. Is it's supposed to be college players against college players, not 22-year-olds against 26-year-olds. Not you don't stay at the same university for 8 years, um, and then say, oh, now I'm gonna go off to the NFL and play for 5 years. That's not how it's supposed to work. But in some universities it does, and I'm not a fan of it. And I think that takes away from college football in its entirety. So now that I've gotten my complaining out of the way, let's move on to the next thing I want to talk about, TCU. So TCU last week got snubbed by the playoff committee. They have they have 4 consecutive ranked wins on their season so far. They lead the Big 12. Their quarterback has 2,200 yards with 22 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, showing that he's a very capable quarterback. And the fact that Clemson last week was ranked higher than TCU shows that the committee is willing to put the blue chip teams above any sort of newcomer to the playoffs. And that bothers me because it shouldn't just be about, how many times has this team been to the playoffs? It should be about this team. Are they the best team this year? Are they one of the best teams this year in college football? And I think TCU crosses that list. I know that they have, I wouldn't say questionable wins, but wins that are closer than you would expect, but they always find this season they have always found a way to win. And I think that if you match them up against USC or Ole Miss or UCLA, Utah, Clemson, even Oregon, they would find a way to win. And I think that's an important thing to think about. Clemson got a lot of help by the committee by keeping all of their ranked wins still ranked wins even after they lost multiple games. They had NC State. They had NC State. They had Wake Forest, and then they had Syracuse. All ranked wins. All shouldn't have stayed ranked, with the exception of Syracuse. Syracuse was the only team that I truly thought should have stayed ranked. I didn't think NC State should have stayed ranked. I didn't think Wake Forest should have stayed ranked. Not even close. Not even close. Um, so I mean it really just shows, in my opinion, the bias um of the committee itself. So let's go over the rankings this year. We'll talk about whether or not I agree with them. So number one, Georgia, absolutely agree, 100%. I think they proved against Tennessee that they were the best team in college football. Um, it'll be interesting if Michigan makes it into the playoff. If we see a rematch of the Orange Bowl last year, what'll happen? Um, I think it'll be pretty interesting. That would be a fun game to watch. Again, I think it would be closer this year than it was in last year's game. So Ohio State number two. I disagree with this, and part of this is my bias towards Michigan. Part of it is the understanding that Northwestern is not a good football team this year. They're not. And we already talked about this. You guys heard my opinions on Northwestern in that Ohio State game. Um, Ohio State obviously should have won by quite a bit more than they did. So I'll leave it at that. All right, Michigan, number three. I think that they should be one higher. I think that their room with um, Ohio State, or their ranking with Ohio State, should be switched. Um, I know that they didn't have the greatest game against Rutgers in the first half, but in the end, Michigan pulled away. They won their game against Rutgers 52-17. I know that they were losing the first half. I think it was 17 to 14 in the first half. Um, Michigan scored 28 points in the third quarter, and another 10 in the fourth quarter. And I know Harbaugh isn't one of those coaches that run up scores. Um, if he wanted to, he probably could have scored another 28 points. Um, in that Rutgers in that fourth quarter. And he probably could have made it 70-17, but as I said, he's not one of those coaches to run up scores. And there's something else I'm going to talk about after I go through about the top 10 playoff rankings. I'll go through them in a little deeper next week, Monday, where the first episode will come out on the College Football Fanatics channel. But I want to talk about something that I noticed at the Rutgers game that I didn't like. That wasn't about Michigan, and it wasn't about It was indirectly about Rutgers. So let's move on. TCU number 4, absolutely. They're the only other undefeated team besides obviously Georgia, Ohio State, and Michigan. Um, I think that their schedule obviously makes them a clear um, a clear um, clear number 4. They have a game coming up against Texas, which I think is going to be a good game. I think TCU is going to find a way to win because they usually do. So yeah, they've gone up three spots. So Tennessee, number 5. I'd agree with that because I don't think that they deserve to be absolutely torpedoed or that their ranking should drop like a stone in water, sink like a stone in water because they lost to Georgia. I mean, most teams on this list would lose to Georgia if they played them today. So it's hard to justify like putting them at like 10th or something like that because I still think that they have a really 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 good offense. Um, Number 6, Oregon. I disagree with this. I think that LSU should be number 6. I think that Oregon should be at best number 10. Um, I get that their only losses to Georgia, and that since then, Oregon has played really, 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 really well. But I still think that, in my opinion, I think UCLA is a better team, and I think that USC is also a better team. So I'd put them somewhere at 9 or 10. Um, but we'll be able to see them play. I think they play both USC and UCLA coming up. I think. Um, Actually, no, they don't. That's my bad. They don't play UCLA or USC. They did play UCLA in week 7, I think. So they did play UCLA in late October, um, and they did win. So I still think UCLA. Um, the fact that UCLA lost to Georgia actually has made me rethink that position of that they should be ranked ahead. So I'm changing my mind on that. I put them somewhere around 8. Um, yeah, 8 sounds about right. So next up, LSU. Absolutely. Sorry, they should be number 6, right behind Tennessee. They've had, even though they have 2 losses, they have a couple of great wins. Um, and I'm excited to see the rest of their season and how that unfolds. Um, it's gonna be really interesting to watch. Um, USC, number 8. Like I said, I believe that they should be number 7. They're 8-1. Um, Caleb Williams has looked pretty strong out there. Um, I think that USC has really used the transfer portal last season really well, and I think that that's starting to show. I think in a couple of seasons, UCLA or USC will be back to some of their former glory, and making the playoff a lot more often than they've been making it. So, um, next up, Alabama, number 9. No, they shouldn't be at number 9. Um, I think that they should be behind Ole Miss. Um, yeah, I this is all. It also might just be my disdain for Alabama and my want to see their downfall. Um, Even though Clemson's strength of schedule is not the greatest, I still think that they should be number 9 and probably Alabama number 10. I wouldn't entirely disagree with that. Sorry, cough in my throat. Clemson number 10. Like I said, I think they should be number 9. But this is the second week of rankings. Um, will I think there's a possibility for 2 Big 10 teams to make it in. I don't think it's a strong possibility right now. There's only 3 teams or 4 teams with I think a better than um, a better than a third chance of making it into the playoffs. And I think that that's the undefeated teams. That's Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, and TCU. As long as TCU wins out, I don't see why they shouldn't be in the playoffs. Um, Ohio State and Michigan. Um, one of them is going to lose because they're obviously going to play each other at the end of the season. I think the how close that game is will determine um, will determine where they where the loser is dropped to. Also, I think Ohio State has a much better chance of making it in if they lose to Michigan than Michigan has if they lose to Ohio State. Although that game is in Columbus, so the committee might rank things differently. I did the playoff predictor and I looked at that scenario specifically. And it said that Michigan, if they lost to Ohio State, they'd have like somewhere like I think it was like a 40% chance of making the college football playoffs. As opposed to Ohio, or sorry, it was like 60% chance of making it. If they lost to Ohio State. Ohio State had like a 70% chance of making it if they lost to Michigan. So, and especially if it's a game that's decided by like a point, then that would be, I think, a strong argument for both of those teams to make it in. And it would be really interesting to see a Michigan Ohio State playoff game. Um, I think that it would make what is already a heated rivalry into an even more heated rivalry, and that would be, I think, a lot of fun. I think that would be a lot of fun to watch. So I want to talk about something that I saw at the Rutgers game that I've noticed in other games in other times, and that's by like the middle of the second of the third half or the third quarter, sorry. Um, Rutgers fans started to leave really quickly. And I have an issue with this. As a Michigan fan who's spent most of his life watching his team lose to Ohio State, to Notre Dame, to Michigan State, to other, schools. I was there for the Brady Hoke era. I was there for the Rich Rodriguez era. Um, I remember seeing some very ugly losses as a Michigan fan. Losses by more than 40 points against some of our most bitter rivals. Um, and I have a serious issue with people leaving like before the middle of the fourth quarter. And even then, I don't necessarily have an issue, but I'm like, you should stay. Um, I get that you might not want to see your team get smacked around um, each week, but the fact of the matter is that the crowd is the 12th man on a football team. Um, they play an important role And I think we saw this with the COVID year, where fans weren't allowed into stadiums, um, and I really think that it's important that fans stay and support their players, um, even if they know that the team is struggling, um, because once fans stop supporting um, their players will stop caring about what happens at these games. Um, and at that point, now you don't have a sport anymore. Now you just have a bunch of people going out with no heart playing. Um, and that's when I think you've really lost the really special parts of college football. I think the enthusiasm of the fans is one of the greatest things college football has to offer. In pro football, you have very enthusiastic fans, but I kind of view college football as a more pure form of that love. Um, and so I think when you decide to leave, say, to beat traffic or something like that, I think that is really sending the wrong message, because it wasn't just a few people leaving at the Rutgers game. It was a huge portion of the Rutgers fans. Now the Michigan fans pretty much stayed, and I think it was because we were biting our nails the entire first half. Um, and so we wanted to see our team and make sure they actually won, and they didn't screw it up, essentially. Um, but it was really sad to watch, because I think because it was really fun to see Rutgers fans getting so hyped at watching their team compete with a really good Michigan team. Um, so I think that was very much um, part of it. And the other thing I wanted to say on this was, um, when you're a fan and you're more concerned about getting out at a reasonable time at a night game, or you're more concerned about beating traffic than supporting your players, I think that has a really bad culture issue. And when recruits come to your school and they see that, um, that plays a part into their choice of where they want to go. Um, the best things that I can think of about going to football games is the fandom. It's the tailgating before the game. It's the cheering. It's the screaming so loudly and so long that the next morning you're not able to talk, essentially. And I think that it can't be understated just how much that is important to a high school kid, um, coming out and watching a game, and looking at that and saying, that's a crowd that I want cheering for me. Um, the one of the reasons I think Georgia won in Athens against Tennessee was the fact that their fans screamed their heads off. I mean, you could hear it from the TV, and I'm sure Tennessee felt very intimidated when you have 100,000 fans essentially screaming at you. I don't know how large Georgia Stadium is, but I'm thinking more of Michigan Stadium, where there's 110,000 fans each game. But when you have 50,000 fans, 100,000 fans screaming at you, it feels it probably energizes you or it really starts to make you nervous and you make mistakes, and the fans can really impact the way a game is played. And Kirby Smart um, said in a press conference um, when he talked about what fans should do at the Tennessee game. He was like, if you can talk the next morning, um, you didn't scream enough, essentially. And while that's like, while that's coming from a team where football is their entire school, um, that idea, that love of the game, that love of that idea of supporting the team should be there for every college football team in every college in every state in this country. Um, and I think that idea of the support really makes a strong argument for, or makes a strong path for players, essentially. Um, Yeah, so that's just I kind of wanted to speak on that. It was just something I noticed that I didn't like. Um, I've seen it happen at Michigan games, um, but I think it tends to happen a lot less, or it's at least a lot less noticeable, just because of how many seats there actually are at a Michigan game. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount at a Michigan home game, at least. Um, but yeah, so that is it for this episode of College Football Fanatics. Um, like I said, on our main channel, we're gonna have episodes. So um I might post a mini episode on Friday. I'm not entirely sure yet. I still have a few things to set up. Um, I almost definitely will post something on Monday. Um, so stay tuned for that. I'm also trying to figure out about putting together like a Twitter and an Instagram. Um, I just have to find a name that isn't already taken for Instagram. So um, I'll let you guys know. I'll put links when I have them down in the description. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Come back next week at 11 o'clock on Wednesday. I'll be here. And I really hope you guys will go over to the other channel and subscribe. And I hope you all have a great day. And I thank you for watching. See you guys next week.